All right, we should be live. Let me double check because it's the first time.
Okay.
So, hmm, there. Oh yeah, so we're already live on Facebook. So,
Okay.
yay for technology. Um,
Yeah, when it works, it's great.
oh yeah, when it
When it
works.
doesn't work,
Well, I'm an IT guy. Oh, we're already live on Twitter, so you can also retweet
cool.
if you want.
Okay.
So that's good. Wow, technology seems to be working. Well, I am an IT guy, so it
Nice.
would be a bit embarrassing for me if it wasn't.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's good news. So yeah. So thank you, Sam Gandhi, for joining me on the podcast.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I was a bit
Um,
like thinking if I would have you on or not because you do research on dangerous drugs. So I wasn't really sure like if it would have been alcohol, if you would have been an alcoholic and drink yourself to oblivion every evening.
mm,
It would have been an easier
yeah,
decision. Still, I decided to give you a chance because these drugs can make you more healthy. And I haven't found
they
any evidence, which surprised me, of alcohol. Maybe the antioxidant thing, but
yeah,
otherwise.
maybe some of the I've heard I did hear a thing that red wine might be actually good. That some of the polyphenols in red wine could be good for your gut flora.
Hmm.
So that was something new I learned. It's like, okay, that's cool. Drink wine. I'm looking after my gut flora, which is obviously
It's a
important.
good
But
excuse to
yeah, no,
drink wine.
sorry.
It's a very good excuse to drink wine.
It is. Now, I was happy to learn that because I'd not really heard, there'd been stuff about blood pressure and what, but it's all like not that convincing. Whereas that was something that's okay, there might be something to this, particularly red wine was mentioned. I think it's more rich in those polyphenol things. But yeah, psychedelics can make you more healthy. Like one of the potentially one of the people who kind of helped ignite the modern psychedelic research renaissance, Bob Jesse, said psychedelics like psilocybin can lead to the betterment of well people.
Hmm.
So obviously, the much of the focus now, scientifically, clinically, is using them as treatments, alongside therapy to varying degrees for things like depression and addiction and post-traumatic stress disorder, existential anxiety, which is great. And all those things I just mentioned, they're not easy things to treat. We don't have particularly effective um,
Yeah.
treatments that exist in mainstream medicine or clinical
For like
practice.
people
So
with
it's
with
great. It's
depression,
like,
some people they try all the
yeah,
antidepressants on the market and
yeah,
nothing seems to be working, and then they have I think two or three psychedelic trips with
yeah,
psilocybin if I'm not mistaken, guided by
yes,
a psychologist of course, and they seem for the first time in their life to be happy again. So
yeah. No, it's quite amazing in terms of the potential. Like there's been some studies conducted by Imperial College kind of recently on a phase 2 study in particular on psilocybin and major depression. And the people signing up to the study were people who tried multiple forms of therapy, multiple antidepressants, and nothing had really
mhm.
worked. And psilocybin really did work. But there is a caveat, before, like, it's important to mention that these things, they are treatments, not cures.
Yeah, yeah.
They are part of a therapy. They can't be disentangled from the therapeutic context. It's a hugely important part of it, and they're acting as amplifiers for the therapeutic process. And the effects are not, in many cases, permanent either, and that's important to mention. So after a few months, people's depression scores can start to sort of creep up again.
Yeah. Are you talking about
So
research now with like a full-blown
I'm
dose of a psychedelic compound, or you're talking
yes.
more about microdosing?
No, I'm talking about using kind of full macro 25 milligrams is kind of the gold standard dose of psilocybin that's used in the studies. And although potency varies hugely in the mushrooms, it's probably equivalent to about 4 to 5 dried grams of cubensis mushrooms. So it's quite a good dose. microdosing is all the science is still
Yeah, yeah.
happening.
It's very little
Um,
science about it. I've seen a recent
it's
study. I don't know if it was really microdose because it was in mice, and how do you define a microdose in mice? But if they had
yeah,
like more cognitive flexibility, if they were given a small amount of LSD and they were proven to have more cognitive flexibility, and you have like what's the name, like medication like risperidone that they give to people with autism, like I haven't myself. That's why I'm interested in it. But it has tons of
mm,
side effects. While I think like
yeah,
something like LSD, which might be very off-putting at first for people because it is a dangerous psychedelic. So you can drink yourself to oblivion all you want,
mm,
but it has no side
yeah.
effects because it binds more specifically, as far as I understand, to some receptors and not to the others, like the medication I mentioned does. So
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting times. I'm quite surprised actually
No,
that it's, well, we cannot call it mainstream by any standard, but
no.
still it's becoming more and more accepted.
Oh,
Um,
definitely. It's things are forwarding and shifting. It's good to see that. One of my good friends actually, she just published a paper on microdosing as part of psychedelic microdosing as
okay.
part of the Imperial team. And one of the findings of her study, which was really interesting, is like microdosing definitely had effects for people, but it was only in the people expecting effects,
Oh,
and it
okay.
was kind of indicating that there was a placebo effect at play. Not to dismiss that, because the placebo effect is something really quite powerful, and I think suggestive of the whole mind over matter and the power of the mind to kind of heal the body.
Hmm.
And that's also been stated that could be happening to some degree even on big doses of psychedelics. Is you take these things with the expectancy that something is going to happen, and maybe something positive, something healing, and they're non-specific amplifiers, so
Hmm.
it's going to maybe take those expectations and vamp them up hugely, and you get this kind of like amazing experience. So yeah, it's disentangling like one's that effect of the placebo and people's expectations from that experience. It's all quite messy and entangled there in an interesting, mysterious way.
Um, yeah. So maybe we should maybe I should have done that from the beginning. We should start by defining a little bit what are psychedelics, because maybe some people listening, they don't have a clue what we're talking about. Maybe they think that something like marijuana is a psychedelic. So
Sure.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so yeah, the term psychedelic can be bandied around a little bit in terms of it can be applied quite widely, which I don't personally agree with. I think the scientific usage of it is denoting substances which exert powerful effects through the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor.
Hmm.
They selectively target a specific serotonin receptor subtype in the brain, and you get certain densities of those receptors in certain parts of your brain, particularly your higher functioning, your neocortex, which is the bit of the brain that makes us kind of human.
I don't think
And
we're all higher functioning, but
no,
yeah,
or
we
maybe
can
we
try
were
to
on a
be.
bit of a sliding scale. I don't feel
Oh,
higher functioning.
I have my rare moments where I
Definitely.
feel functioning, and that's already something.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, they can be. I mean, the classical psychedelics, which have been researched for a while and have been used by mankind for a long time, are things like psilocybin, found in magic mushrooms, DMT in the form of ayahuasca,
Hmm.
mescaline in the form of peyote and San Pedro cacti, and LSD, which has been around for a while. So things like that, and they're all the commonality between them is they're all highly non-toxic. They're not physically dangerous substances. There's not really any risk of overdose, really. Well, particularly LSD and psilocybin, the tryptamine psychedelics.
Hmm.
Um, they're non-addictive. They don't have addictive properties. They don't cause brain damage or any organ damage to the body. and they are profoundly powerful in their effects on consciousness, on the psyche. And that's, I guess, the commonalities that are shared by these substances.
Yeah, when we talk about addiction, we can ask the question, how do you find addiction? Maybe physiologically you cannot become addicted to something, but you can be addicted, at least it's how I view it, to the feeling that something gives you. And
Yep.
besides that, every up comes with a down. So there's always the contrast, I think, in your consciousness between the highs you had and the feelings you had during an experience like that, and then the coming down period afterwards.
Yeah, but it's a strange one. So just to mirror that view back, I think an interesting thing to think about here is, so compare, say, tobacco and LSD.
Hmm.
So
It's a good
LSD, you
conversation
know,
starter.
on a good trip on LSD can induce profound feelings of bliss.
Hmm.
We're talking like cosmic levels of bliss and utter beauty and radiance. And but most people, and it's most some people, they I think they do chase the psychological effects of these things, but it's certainly a minority exception rather than the rule. But despite it having this power to induce powerful feelings of bliss,
Hmm.
it's not an addictive substance, and in fact it's been used in the past to sort of treat addiction. Then you take something like tobacco. Well, that doesn't induce any feelings of bliss and is incredibly addictive,
Hmm.
amazingly addictive. So we can't quantify the blissful effects of something or its capacity for inducing states of bliss to its addictive potential. It's not as simple as that, I don't think.
Yeah, well, I agree. Well, I did a ceremony in the Amazon with ayahuasca. So,
Mhm.
well, I did a couple of them. And it was also after I've had the ceremonies, I had the feeling I have enough of this. Like you have your visions, like the bliss you mentioned. You have
Yeah.
the dissolution of your ego. There was even a moment where I could not remember how I looked like myself. There was just I was one with experience, and I was very connected with nature, obviously, because I was in the middle of the
Yeah.
Amazon rainforest.
Sure.
But after it, I'm done with this. I really don't need another one. So I think um, your brain operates in kind of another way, both in terms of neurotransmitters and the networks
Yeah.
in your brain. And I think it gives you valuable information if you want it, if you accept it, because
Yeah.
if you try to push things away, I think it can come back another way, which I've also seen.
Yes.
But then I think you're good for a while, and maybe after some months you feel like you're stuck a bit again in some let's call it modern conditioning of the mind, and then so yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah. No, I think that's the kind of yeah, yeah, I think that resonates with how other people describe it as well, definitely.
Um, yeah, the experience that we had in the Amazon was that there was a somebody there who had post-traumatic stress. So
Mhm.
that's something that is quite a promising therapeutic area for these compounds. And
Yeah.
I think, first of all, he did not know that what he had was post-traumatic stress. And secondly, the shaman had absolutely no clue about the concept of post-traumatic stress. And he was really,
Mm.
uh, I think, pushing things away. And after a moment, he really got a, I would call it a psychosis, because some other guy in the ceremony, he was snoring and he became really enraged, like totally,
Mm.
yeah, totally out of his mind, if I can call it like that, because of this guy
Yeah.
snoring, he didn't have any visions that would change his life. So I yeah, I think it certainly didn't help that guy. And I think if the shaman would have had a more psychological, maybe even psychiatric upbringing, he could have helped him. But I think sometimes there's too
Um,
much hocus pocus involved in these
yes.
indigenous ceremonies.
Well, I mean, this is a complex. I think it's an important point you've just made, but it's a complex situation. So,
Hmm.
firstly, it's important not to paint all the shamans with the same
Yeah,
brush.
yeah, yeah.
You know, there are some people and indigenous shamans who really, really, really
Yeah.
know their
And I
stuff.
think, by the
You
way, he
know.
was a very good shaman, but I think he was
Mm.
just not ready for somebody
Yeah,
with that much. Like he
no,
can
well, I
handle
think
normal
it's
people, but I mean, for that, you need to
yeah.
be a psychiatrist or have similar
No,
experience.
it's an important point to make here. It's like there's a big difference between, shamanism or indigenous shamanism and then like medically supervised or like psychotherapeutically supervised psychedelic sessions. Because obviously, like, in more clinical context, people are screened going into these studies.
Hmm.
They've got usually a pair of um, therapists that they've already built a kind of report up before going into that experience, who will sort of know the situation in terms of their medical history and stuff like that. So there's much less capacity for these kind of situations to emerge, which could potentially be really, like, at the very least unhelpful, and at worst like really really quite bad, not just for the person involved but potentially for other people there.
Hmm.
It's sort of a bad situation. So yeah, it highlights, that the Synthesis Institute, which I know some of the people involved with quite well, who sort of offer like psilocybin retreats in the
Hmm.
Netherlands, to what I see as a really high level. Like they take care, sort of medically screening. They take great care over the set and setting and the people they sort of use on these things. And they talk of fair weather tripping, in
Okay.
terms of, you're getting all these charlatan shamans and people offering to guide psychedelic sessions, and it's all well and good when it's like, your friend or like people that are otherwise essentially mentally healthy.
Hmm. Or you
But
think
like
they
if
are?
someone yeah, well, yeah, that as well. If you think they are, exactly, because you've not maybe done the medical screen, you don't know their history. Like, but if you get someone come in who's got an underlying condition of some kind,
Hmm.
like got some deep trauma, got an undiagnosed or family history of schizophrenia, psychosis, or borderline personality disorder, you could be in way over your head, and that's a dangerous situation, for all involved. So yeah, it's important one knows really what they're doing when they're using these very powerful tools, particularly in the context of heating of treating or trying to treat deep-seated mental trauma or illness. It's a volatile mix, and you need to know what you're doing. Otherwise, you could be worse off than when you started. Definitely.
Yeah. And I was thinking before starting this podcast, with you, that I should mention multiple times that you should do it responsibly, certainly because of all the stigma involving these compounds. So that's why I keep on mentioning it. But after a while, I think I've mentioned it enough. And yeah, we can really start to go a bit deeper into the good things that these compounds can do, and why, how we think at least uh, that they work, because it's a bit weird, I think, these days that alcohol is so soon into our culture. It's so accepted. While I
Mm.
think I think that the death because of alcohol each year is absolutely an astonishing number of people, both by
Oh
addiction
yeah.
and suicide and traffic accidents. Um,
Well, no, it's yeah. Look, I mean, it's very much linked to like domestic abuse
yeah,
cases. It's horrendously toxic in any amount. There's no real, they say about if you have a bit and it helps your blood pressure. I mean, that's any
that's
amount
just looking
is a
for an
carcinogen.
excuse to have a glass, I
Yeah,
think.
I mean, I did say about
Yeah,
the red
yeah.
wine, and so let's put that in
Everybody
its
does it,
sort of its
but
own little. But so it's sort of, it's just because yeah, cultural perceptions dictate so much of how we view things,
hmm.
unfortunately. So if we viewed like alcohol through the lens of what the science says, we'd probably come to a very different picture. than what we have now. But it's just been part of our history, part of our culture, particularly here in Western Europe for such a long time that it's just embedded as part of our culture, particularly here in the UK.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, a lot of Europe, but it's a big part of British culture is pub, drinking culture. Whereas other things like psychedelics, it's that's the that's the cultural taboo, and that's something that's like not accepted in mainstream society and considered dangerous and controversial and all these things. And it's important to say there are risks. I mean, like
Hmm.
alcohol in its own way is a very powerful drug. It affects, if you drink enough of it, it starts to sort of numb and sort of turn off bits of
Yeah,
your brain.
yeah,
Like,
it's the
and
opposite like what a psychedelic would do. It just shuts you off from all the
mm,
things that can come from the gates of your
yeah,
subconscious, while the LSD or other substances, they do the exact opposite. So yeah.
yeah. No, I think that's quite a nice, simple way of describing it. That's what it does. Yeah, sort of seem like it's like, yeah, the alcohol's kind of numbing and closing down the sort of filters and what's going on, whereas the psychedelics, it's, yeah, they're powerfully sort of opening them. It's going the other
Did you
way.
read what's the name from Aldous Huxley? His book was it the Gates of Perception, I think.
Yeah, the doors of
Yeah,
perception. Yes, I have once upon a time.
it's
Yeah,
one. Yeah, I really like him as an author, but then
yeah.
just him describing his experience with these substances, it's really I think it's really interesting, like as a first step for people who might think that these things would help them in some way. Is
Mm,
just maybe to give that a read, and then as a second step, maybe I think there's a lot of clinical studies going on now. Certainly in the Netherlands and oh no, in the Netherlands and Switzerland, certainly at the Imperial College.
yeah,
So um, there's certainly enough of
yeah,
a lot of stuff people can investigate.
yeah. There is. I mean, obviously, you might encountered it, but Michael Pollan's book,
Hmm.
How to Change Your Mind, has sort of created ripples in the last few years as well. That's sort of gained, I guess, more mainstream readership.
Yeah.
I guess like a similar thing to, although they're different characters, him and Aldous Huxley, both kind of well
Hmm.
respected mainstream writers, essentially. And so when they start experimenting with these things and communicating them eloquently, it builds bridges to a different crowd or to more people than, say, your average hippie, maybe kind of
It's like if I would write a
externally like
blog
you.
post, that would be the average hippie maybe. Uh, but yeah, I was astonished by the book of Michael Pollan in how mainstream he made it sound. He made it sound like it was the most normal thing in the world. It
Yeah.
was really like a scientific process that he was exploring. So
Mm.
um, yeah, it was a really really good book.
Yeah. No, I enjoyed it.
And
Uh,
so I took a chance to Google you a little bit because that's what I have to do. And I saw that you worked with what's his name, Robin Cohort Harris, because he's also I'm really bad at pronouncing English names. So.
Yes, no, that's his name. Yeah, so Robin heads the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial
Hmm.
College, and I'm an external collaborator with that group. And Robin sort of kindly invited me to kind of be involved in some capacity, sort of 2 years ago, actually now, because he kind of knew of my interest in the nature connection slash ecology side of psychedelics, and so he was sort of, yeah, he was open to some kind of collaboration there, which ended up being really fruitful and interesting.
Yeah, well, I've read your research some weeks ago, and it's really interesting because it touches both the subject of our connection with nature, and I think certainly these days with COVID, at least in Belgium, everybody is rediscovering nature. Certainly, we
Mm,
now feel that we have disconnected a little bit. I wonder how long it will
yeah,
last the effect, but at least for the moment it's good. And secondly, it touches
yes,
the subject of psychedelics. and it's also, I think, certainly with COVID now, it's also very relevant because you also mentioned existential anxiety, and I think certainly now in Europe for the first time we are we are yet again reminded that we are not all powerful and that we will die someday, and there's a lot of uncertainty which we cannot really control, and we just our mind cannot handle it. Well, I think like in countries like Africa, they're used to it. Like they know the concept. This
Yeah.
is good enough. They're very. I think they're way better with handling uncertainty. We need perfect solutions, and that brings indecisiveness.
Mm.
But uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's an interesting point. I do think we're like, I was having a conversation with someone very recently about this need, this fixation with
Oh
certainty
yeah. It's.
might not be all it's
I
cracked
had
up
it for a
to
big
be.
part in my life. I think. I still have it
Yeah.
if I'm not careful.
Mm.
But I think yeah, it's like part of a I think a conditioning of the mind. I think it's your genetics, but it's also I think your upbringing, and you just continually have like this. I would call like this learned behavior of separating the world into different aspects and then continuously trying to achieve something in which you have the assumption that it would improve your life in some way. But then,
Mm.
if you really think about it, most of these things don't really matter. Like you have food, you have shelter, so life is maybe too easy. Um,
Mm.
Now, yet we keep worrying about uncertainty that doesn't really um, uh, would imply physical harm onto us. So
Yeah.
we're really like lost in abstractions, I would think.
Yeah. I guess is that like partly kind of media bombardment and all being hyper connected through the internet? It's sort of maybe amplifying these kind of anxieties or concerns, I guess, as well. It's probably playing a part in it.
Yeah, I interviewed. Do
Um,
you know Sheldon Solomon? He is a psychologist, and he
mm,
does a lot of research about how the fact that we will die and that we're only conscious beings, at least as far as we know, that are conscious about our ending, how
mm,
it makes us cling to religion and a sense of self-esteem that needs to live further, and how we vote for political leaders like Trump because they remind of
mm,
us of our ending because of the fear tactics, which is the same that Hitler
yeah,
used as well. So
yeah.
it's interesting how we tend to change into a completely different people once we are reminded of our own ending. So
Mm, yeah. No, it's interesting. We're very, we're a very emotional and kind of irrational species. We're not particularly led, unfortunately, by facts
that's
and
putting it very
rationality. Like,
lightly, I think.
yeah, which is a bit of a shame, you know. Like, it'd be nice if there was a bit more balance there, but it's not always a negative thing. In the fact that nature connectedness, which is one of the things I'm interested in, part of my
Hmm.
research. It's there's a study, not a non psychedelic study, a very simple nature connectedness enhancing intervention where you essentially the intervention was you basically you in your day-to-day life you kind of take time to notice nature,
Okay.
anything that you enjoy or love or anything that catches your attention, and you simply make a note of
Hmm.
it, and
Okay.
you record 3 things a day about nature for
Hmm.
5 days. And the control group in this study, they recorded factual things. So they did exactly the same, 3 things for 5 days, and they just recorded 3 facts a day about nature. There was no change for them in their nature connectedness, like not immediately afterwards, not at two
Hmm.
months follow up. Whereas the people who were noting emotive things in nature rather than knowledge rational based, they had this sort of robust increase in nature connectedness, and it was still there, still sustained at 2 months later. So, I don't want to belittle our emotional side because it's a fundamental and very important part of our human makeup.
Hmm.
But it's good to be aware of
Yeah.
it and how much it kind of overshadow the sort of the factual, logical, rational thinking side sometimes.
Yeah, I think we're now less and less in a fight or flight situation where there's a lion in front of us when we walk through the streets. So I think we can probably be a bit more rational and follow a bit less our instincts like 1,000 years ago. I don't know if there were lions in Belgium 1,000 years ago. Maybe let's take. Were there ever lions in Belgium? I don't know.
Yes, no, that there would have been. We had lions. We had not even that long. Well, I mean, we're talking like quite a few thousand years ago. But we did have lions and cave lions in this part of the world because obviously, yeah, the UK and Belgium or Europe were linked
Ah,
back
yeah,
then.
yeah. Now we're definitely
Um,
in, even in the abstractions, not linked anymore with the
yeah,
Brexit.
but it's interesting though in terms of what you're saying about in Belgium that there's been a kind of an acknowledgement through the COVID restrictions of nature
Hmm.
and the value people have been reevaluating their relationship to and their connection with nature because it's definitely happened here. And some people talk about this consciousness revival of us all reconnecting to nature. Now I would like to believe that, but I'm a little bit more cynical as you are, like how much this will persist into the future. Like it's in terms of changing consciousness is not particularly in a deep, sustained, enduring way is not an easy thing to do
Hmm.
particularly, and that's why psychedelics are interesting because they can and do that. And them on their own I don't think is enough. I think they need to be used in a certain context in a certain way as agents of as catalysts of
Yeah,
connection, but how you're using them and what you're connecting to is a very important part of that usage, I
yeah,
think.
I completely agree. I think you could go to a psychologist for years and years, but in the end, the psychologist has her view of your consciousness. She will never be able to really experience what you experience. She can only have the assumption of what you're experiencing and have an assumption what treatment would work and then try to combine these assumptions. Whilst if you are your own therapist, you let all your gates open. You say bring it on. Whatever comes, it might
Yeah.
hurt. It's here to help me. I think that's how you decondition a mind because it's really about deconditioning. We've been through traumatic experiences, through just the way our brain works, like both the neurotransmitters or the lack of connections between brain regions. We have just these learned patterns of, I would almost call it survival, or the assumption that it makes us survive. And then we must find some way to like stop and say, hey, what am I doing? Is this really making me healthy? Should I change something? And yeah, I always call it like my experience with the ayahuasca. It would have been 10 or 20 years of therapy, and it was all condensed in one day. It was well worth the money.
Yes. No, and it's interesting. I think what you're saying there as well. It's like I think there's, you know, even if you're with a good and skilled therapist, and I don't in any way want to belittle like the power of a good
Hmm.
skilled therapist, but like when you get insights on life issues from yourself, from what is you could be labeled as your higher self or your subconscious, like there's a certain like inarguable authenticity, like a solidity to those insights that's going to be stronger than if they're coming from outside you, from someone else, because it's you mirroring yourself,
Hmm.
you know. So I think there's a power there, which is important, which is why these things work so well as therapeutic aids and amplifiers.
Yeah, I think it's the same at all these self-help books. A self-help book is a book that tells you how something helped the person that has written the book. But everybody needs to figure things out by themselves. It's also why I have this podcast. I talk about the concept who or what we are with 20 people, but then they shouldn't pick one version that they like and okay, this is my truth. You should figure out for yourself
Yeah.
who you are and why this question matters to you or not. Maybe it doesn't matter. Which makes me think I haven't asked you that question, which is actually very bad podcasting from my part. So um, maybe we should just get into that. I will just see if we have any questions because we have like this live thing. We're very much into the new technology. Um, I don't know if I have. Ah, yeah, we have quite some viewers. Um, I don't know if can you also share it on Twitter maybe? Then maybe
Um,
people following
yeah.
you might have some questions. Um, Let me see.
But yeah,
Ah, I have a
maybe.
question here already. Um, so I have a question from somebody who asked, so does this mean that you can take as much of a psychedelic as you want and there will be no physical risk?
Um, Firstly, it depends on the psychedelic. So, no, something like mescaline, 5-MeO DMT, don't do that. Otherwise, DMT itself can cause spikes in blood
Mm-hmm.
pressure and pulse. So, so no, it doesn't. It varies on the substance. They're all on their own individual sliding scales. Psilocybin and LSD are particularly non-toxic and safe in a physical sense. Um, so while yeah, your physical body might be okay if you have too much, and there was an interesting paper actually published recently by a researcher, and he was discussing cases of accidental massive overdose of LSD where people
Okay.
have accidentally, unwittingly dosed themselves. And in all the cases, actually, although I think someone maybe put themselves in a coma or something for a
Hmm.
time, in all cases, there were no, not only were there no long term sort of physical or even psychological issues, but some of the people inadvertently cured themselves from various different conditions that they had at the
Hmm.
time, sort of just
Don't say
accidentally. So,
cancer now
serendipity.
because then I don't believe you.
No, it wasn't cancer. One of them, I think it was one of them was it was a nerve based condition. I don't know if they had chronic nerve
Hmm.
pain, neuralgia. I don't know if that's how you say it. I can't recall what the other ones, other things were, but people found, these are only. It's
Yeah.
important to say these are only isolated cases. There's not a good
Mm-hmm.
sample size here, but then again, there's not a good sample size of people accidentally having
Mm-hmm.
massive doses
Yeah,
like
I
this.
think that's
You
good.
know, but yeah, but it was interesting. It was certainly made for interesting reading. Not that I'm advocating that in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, no. The short answer for psychedelic LSD and psilocybin, like physically, your body will be okay, but mentally is a whole different story. And if you're mentally sort of at risk, that also means physically you are
Mm-hmm.
at risk. So that's something to be kind of aware of.
Yeah, I think yeah, again when you compare it to alcohol, I mean, if you have too much of alcohol, if you would drink as much alcohol as you probably could, there's a high probability you would die. Whilst yeah, with at least with LSD and psilocybin, I think ayahuasca is something else, and because the DMT, you have to be careful with drug interactions and things like that. Like if you
Yes.
would take
Oh
it
yeah,
with
no, there are definitely
anti-malaria.
like
Um,
things to be aware of in terms of interactions and MAOI interactions with ayahuasca and stuff like that. But no, they're remarkably sort of physically non toxic.
and like you say, like they can have surprising effects because I've learned like you have all these cytokines in our body, and I've read that LSD is actually promising in making your body produce less TNF, and that way having a less severe inflammation
Mm,
effect. So
yeah,
I would have never
that's
expected that, but I was browsing some biological pathways because that's what I do in my free time, and I was like, whoa, this is interesting.
yeah. No, it is interesting. I mean, this is I think now a kind of new cutting edge frontier. Actually, is the whole the role of like inflammation and chronic inflammation in
Hmm.
health conditions, both physical and possibly mental. And then the application of psychedelics as potent anti-inflammatories, and this is like in potentially in like sub psychedelic doses as well. They can still have this effect.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is kind of a new frontier, I think, that's opening up.
And it's kind of logical in some sense, I think, because a lot of these things that have to do with inflammation and too much stress on the body, um, it's also very linked with physical stress. If
Mm.
your cortisol levels are way too high and things like that, so it's somehow logical that a psychedelic that would have you have another point of view that it would also have physical implications for your body. Although this is a total non-scientific assumption, but it's definitely something worth exploring, I think.
Mm. Well, one of the kind of hypotheses that's put forward for how psychedelics can work, and I think it's quite an interesting one actually, is that they can induce or bring about a state of homeostasis or
Ah, okay.
equilibrium in your system.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, they obviously then have downstream effects
Ah,
on
okay.
your physiology. So I think that's an interesting potential take of what they might do
I find
or
it
can do.
interesting the word homeostasis because, like, I speak from my experience, but um, something that a lot of people with autism have is that they don't have a homeostasis in their neurons. So
Mm,
their neurons they keep on firing on the same intensity, even though something is already very old and you should have probably considered new information around you, and you should let go of the things you're actively working on. But a lot of people with autism, they can't let go of that, and they can't let go of details. And then you see again that things like LSD, they can influence these pathways
yeah,
that are bound to the receptors involved that are correlated with this cognitive flexibility. So
yeah.
yeah, and that's why my assumption is that microdosing for some therapeutic areas could be quite beneficial because if you have autism and you could have more cognitive flexibility, I think you would see huge behavior changes.
Mm, yeah. No, interesting. No, there's so much to kind of explore here. I think that this field is real, although it had its a brief heyday in the 50s, 60s. That was barely enough for it really to get going, and now it's heating back up again. So there's lots of interesting and possibly really fruitful terrain here to be explored, I think.
Yeah.
But I was thinking now, with regard the concept of self.
Mhm.
I thought it
Ah,
might be
yeah.
an
Thank you for
interesting
reminding
thing
me
to bring
on
up.
the
No
subject.
worries, because
Hmm.
obviously psychedelics kind of feed into this in a really interesting way. Because one of the things that they reliably, so your sense of self, is kind of that's considered a component of your ego. Your
Yeah.
subjective sense of self identity, which is kind of concocted by the brain. And one of the things that psychedelics can fairly reliably do at high doses is they can induce this feeling of ego dissolution. This experience of
Yeah.
ego dissolution,
Do
where
you speak
your
from your own
subjective.
experience?
Yeah, I guess I'm speaking from my own experience
Hmm.
and also just the clinical studies as
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
well. And yeah, it can, that experience is like a dissolving of barriers and boundaries.
Hmm.
And so to the point where even things like concepts like times can start to break down as well, and the
Mm.
linearity of time. But like, yeah, one of the reliable things is this feeling where, like the feeling of perceived boundaries dissolve. So, like, you know, I have this right now, this strong feeling of existing as me, Sam, as a separate individual entity. And I acknowledge that, you know, you're Stephen, you're a separate entity yourself, and we're having this exchange. But in that sort of in that state where your kind of ego dissolves, there's that that that's the that those rigid barriers between self and other selves, self and other, really sort of really dissolves and breaks down. And when it does so, it can produce this yeah, this feeling or this perception of kind of self other or self nature
Hmm.
overlap. Like there's not that defined boundary between self and other is kind of gone, and it's hard to sort of like yeah, hard to sort of sense where that is, and that can be a really powerful experience. So we know from the research that this experience of ego dissolution is correlated strongly with the mystical type peak experiences that people report. It's part of the neural basis, it seems, of these deep unitive um, states of oneness that people can experience. And this is really interesting because it seems to be linked to people to the increases in nature connectedness that people experience under psychedelics. And so nature connectedness, what I mean by that, and it's important to define it,
Hmm.
is it's a
Yeah,
sense
and
of
how do you measure it?
so yeah, it's so to define it, it's a sense of oneness or in the perception of oneness or interconnection with the natural world, a sustained awareness of the interrelatedness of the self
Hmm.
with nature. And of course, like my background, my scientific background is ecology, which and ecology is the science of living systems and the interconnection of living systems. Like interconnection is a fundamental bedrock of ecology. So, you know, we are all part of nature. We are interconnected as part of nature. That to me is like the objective overview. In terms of measuring it, it's fairly simple in the sense that the only way you can actually measure this, you can't, although we can maybe look for mechanisms like ego dissolution in the brain, you can't really measure nature connectedness without asking people, you know? So you have basically, there's many different measures that have been developed, and they're usually, some of them are pictorial, but most of them are given, you're given statements that
Hmm.
are questioning you on different aspects of your relationship with nature, how much value that you place on it, your emotional feelings towards it, what your inclination to have concern for or protect it, things like that. And you answer on a sliding scale of 1 to 5, you know, 0 not at all, 5 absolutely, and that's it. So it's fairly sort of simple thing to assess, but that doesn't sort of that simplicity doesn't belie its power. And I should emphasize that, like nature connectedness, like there's a vast body of scientific psychological research now showing that nature connectedness is strongly associated with eudaimonic well-being. So different measures of well-being, such as life satisfaction, life meaning, vitality, purpose in life,
Hmm.
self-reported personal growth, things like this kind of fall under the umbrella of this particular form of well-being, and nature connectedness is strongly associated with this. And in addition, it is a strong, if not the strongest, predictor of pro-environmental attitude and behaviors as well. And it's interesting just to compare our concept of self. So I think psychedelics potentially they can bring about this realization of the ecological self.
Hmm.
And the ecological self is something much more permeable than the self kind of known to psychology. So we in the West, we live quite a individualistic, egotistical lives.
Yeah, that's an
You know?
understatement, I think.
Yes, compare to various indigenous groups, you know, and they tend to live compared to us much more group community referenced existences and much more nature connected existences as well. And one of the interesting and important side effects, if you like, of deep nature connection is when you look at your surrounding environment, you don't see it as something separate and other. You see it as an extended aspect of self. And that reframes your relationship to it because why would you willingly, wantonly destroy your habitat or your environment when you'd just be harming yourself?
Yeah, I
That
agree.
that's the sort of protective intuition that stems from this deep connection. And one of the great tragedies and great dangers of our civilization as it exists now is through our advancement, which I'm not again going to belittle because it's brought us many good things, but we are severing, we more and more we are eroding our connection to nature more and more as time passes through increasing technological dependency, through declining biodiversity, through increasing urbanization. And because of that, because this connection to nature is declining, not only does that have big important implications for our mental health and well-being as a species, but also we are losing the intuitive, protective um, sense of stewardship and protection towards nature as that connection is diminishing. And I feel that this disconnection from nature, it is the root that's lying beneath, that's behind the environmental crisis that we now face. Like this environmental crisis we face is largely its roots are largely psychological rather than strictly environmental.
Yeah.
So
It's like
unless
when you
we
ask the
see,
question, who or what are we? It already creates separation. It implies that there is something separate from the rest of the experience. And
mm,
I agree. When I did the ayahuasca in the Amazon, I could not even remember how I looked like. There was just experience, and it didn't matter who I was. It was just I was one. I
mm,
was in the normally I'm somebody who can be quite sensory overloaded, and it's weird
yeah,
because in the Amazon it's full of sounds at night. It's absolutely
yeah,
astonishing. Still, my brain didn't have any problems with it, and I think that's
mm,
also because it's nature sounds, and our
yes,
brain has evolved so much that we it's there's probably some interesting studies about just what nature sounds do with our brain as well, because
yeah,
um,
yes. No, it's an important, yeah, it's interesting. You have to be careful defining these things in terms of, like humans are nature. We
mhm,
are part of nature, even if it feels like, that we're not. We very much are, and we come from it, we're dependent on it, we are part of it. So even when we make new synthetic drugs or we concoct synthetic things, we're still nature, like
mhm,
nature kind of acting out, putting different bits of nature together in new novel ways. And it's you have to be careful with how you frame humans in relation to the natural world
yeah,
because you don't want to like seed yet more disconnection by putting up barriers. But it's interesting what you said there. Like, so we know from the scientific literature that people's brains, people's physiology responds very differently from being in a kind of more nature enriched environment to being in kind of a busy urban environment. And my view is it's like rather than saying that's natural and that's man-made and creating this binary division,
mhm. Yeah, we
which I
have to
don't
be very careful with language. Like
yeah, I don't
the
I
moment you
don't
ask a
think that's
question, you create
that's
some kind
helpful.
of division in some
Yeah,
way.
no, I don't think it's helpful. But what I think is perhaps a better way of viewing it is like the biophilic potential of different environments. So essentially, rather than saying they're man-made, natural, or urban, rural, um, how much non-human life do they contain?
Mm,
How much
okay.
life is there that's not us? And I think that in terms of abundance and in terms of the overall biodiversity, and I think that's perhaps a better metric to use because it's not necessarily, you know, seeding this division between man and nature. And and also like cities can be, they don't have to be lacking in nature. Some of the parks in London are like teeming with bird life. Like you can incorporate biophilic design. You can build nature in to your city, so it doesn't need to be something that's far away and that you need to go to, and it
Yeah,
shouldn't be. It
it's right.
should be
It's
a
like
right for everyone
people say
to.
we should be more in nature, and automatically you assume that there's nature and then there's everything else.
Yeah, no, and it's particularly here, in the UK. I mean, we are considered, we're rated as one of the most nature depleted parts of the world.
Oh, you
Our
should live in the north of Belgium. It's absolutely astonishing. I think we're one of the most densely populated places, certainly in Europe.
mm,
It's it's sometimes a bit depressing. It's just there's no forest. Well, there's some, but if you would
yeah,
go to other countries and travel, you could be days
yeah.
without
Well,
seeing civilization. It's just
there's not lots. That's one of the things. Yeah, it's a bit of a shame about the UK. There's not lots. We've got a few forests dotted around, but we're not particularly forested. One of the least got some of the least woodland cover in all of Europe. And like we live, although we look to the countryside as nature, it's like it's a very it's a very manicured, manipulated, sculpted, watered down version of nature
hmm
compared to what it was. And this is an interesting, important thing that's a real challenge facing humanity. Like this concept of shifting baseline syndrome, and it's something worth bringing attention to think about. So it's this idea that every new generation of human that comes into the world,
hmm
they will take their kind of surrounding level of nature, their surrounding abundance of wildlife and biodiversity as the baseline. That's how much nature there is. And then they will judge any loss or gain in nature based on that prior childhood amount. Um, but obviously, that that's not the full bigger picture. That's not taking into account the quality or the level or diversity of nature or wildlife that was around, say, 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or
hmm
200 years ago. So each generation, the bar the bar is being lowered about our expectations of what nature is in terms of its richness and diversity. So there's this chronic erosion of our expectations over time, and that poses a huge threat again to our mental well-being and to the possibility of like it's an unfortunate negative loop in that as sort of biodiversity, as the quality of the environment and the richness of the environment degrades, you're less likely to be connected to it. You're less likely to want to protect and conserve it. So over
yeah,
time,
it becomes
there's
like a
this kind of
vicious circle.
negative cycle. Yeah, it's yeah, really bad.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that because I think just based on, like you say, my own baseline, my own conditioning, I consider the countryside nature until now. But now actually I have to reconsider because is it really it's nature that has been put away and replaced by grass,
Mm,
so that cows can have enough food so we can eat the cow, so we can have the milk. So yeah, there's definitely arguments for the vegan or at least the vegetarian approach to life
yeah.
still. And I'm talking from my own experience. It's so hard because you know it's good for the world.
Mm,
You know it's actually good for yourself because the detrimental effects um, of the climate change and things like that will certainly come
yeah.
back to the individual. Still, it's so hard to do, and I think one thing is, like we mentioned before, like um, we are so irrational. If we don't see an imminent threat, we don't act. And I think with COVID, it was very visual. You know, with all the cases in Italy that were being shown on the
Yeah.
TV, it was very direct. It was unknown. It triggered all the things on the checklist of have a very, I have to be careful what I say, but a kind of an overreaction, maybe, at least
Mm,
from the individual level, not the government level.
Yeah.
And I think it's too bad that we don't have that with the ecology. Maybe we should have more posters of cities becoming full of water, or even,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's an interesting point what you were saying before actually, about, like we don't encounter lions anymore. We don't have to worry about that
Hmm.
immediate
Oh,
threat to our
that would make
existence.
my life so simple. I mean, if there were lions, I didn't have to
Yeah,
worry about anything else. I would just, oh,
yeah.
I'm so glad there's no lions here. I'm happy. So it would be wonderful.
But it's an interesting point because what you're saying there, it belies. So our concern about lions or predator or other predators, other ways that we could be killed or die, is very, very ancient. It
Hmm.
predates our species. And what that means is our brains have evolved to deal with immediate short-term threats to our existence. We're very good at that. We
Oh
have
yeah.
adrenaline, we have the flight or fight reflex, our systems are primed. So when you're dealing with something like climate change or biodiversity loss and the existential threat they pose, it's happening on a spatial and temporal scale that the brain can't really fully grasp. And unfortunately, due to that, doesn't consider a direct existential threat because
Yeah.
it just doesn't trigger its flight or fight
Yeah,
programming in the
exactly.
same way.
Our
It
brain is
does for
not
some.
conditioned that way.
No, no, we're not. So that's the other thing, So in terms of this stuff like the shifting baseline syndrome, in terms of the way we react to threats to our existence, we've got to transcend and become more than our human psychology, than how we've evolved to be. We need to kind of step up and become more than what we often are if we're going to like rise and step up to the plate and sort of take on and deal with these high level challenges that we we do face now. And if you don't believe that, we're damn well gonna face them in the coming decades.
Yeah, that's why I said I fear so much that all the, let's call it the good things that come from COVID, they will be forgotten very soon, just because when the imminent threat is gone for people, I think we cannot generalize, but I think the motivation is gone.
Yeah.
However, I do think that COVID, besides all the bad things, the horror and the people dying, it was kind of a good stress test for, I think, big institutions and governments in general, because at least I think in Belgium we are known to be very conservative, and
Hmm.
if things work good enough, we don't really have much problems or issues. We just keep going, and now suddenly huge uh, these huge organizations had, with so many people, they had to change something, and they didn't change anything for decades. And it's interesting how it showed how inefficient that a lot of big institutions were, including, for instance, the FDA for getting vaccines through clinical trials. Not that that's not important, but in some way, I think, I don't know if you know Nassim Taleb, the guy who wrote The Black Swan. It's sometimes good to have a little forest fires, because that um, strengthens the system. It's better that than having one huge fire that obliviates
Mm.
everything. And I think
Yeah.
that's a good way to put it. And I hope that we learned something from this crisis, so that the fire, not that we can call it a little fire, is comes to good use. But I don't know if
Yeah.
you are as cynical as I am, but I'm a bit afraid.
I am pretty cynical. When it comes to this stuff, I am. I'm otherwise, I think, be considered quite happy-go-lucky, quite positive. I've got quite a positive, chirpy disposition towards
That's
life and
because you
stuff.
take
But
too much psychedelic drugs, probably.
but I don't know the scale of the environmental existential threat that we face as a species. That does I don't see. Basically, like my view is like, and I'm I like to try and work on stuff that I feel like is positive, but
Hmm.
my overall consensus is it's going to get probably a lot worse before it gets better. I just have this sinking feeling that humans are going to have to be pushed onto the thin ice before they're sort of before they'll step up to the plate and do what needs to be done. And I kind of wish I didn't have that view, but the way things are going, that's the way I feel like. Although there are like islands of resistance and pushback. There are motivated, passionate, driven, amazing humans
Hmm.
that are aware of this stuff and they are thinking ahead and long term and they are doing proactive, great stuff. So there are, yeah, it's not a completely bleak picture. There are people that give me hope.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think a guy like I don't know if you are a fan of his, but like Elon Musk,
Mm,
um, he is thinking really big picture, long term, at least, or at least he is having an astonishing marketing effort to make it look that way. So I think
yeah,
yeah, I think he's a very inspiring guy. He's clearly
he's
very
certainly,
optimist. He's very
yeah,
smart, and he just uses his skill for the better. But then again, it's not all perfect. I mean, the energy for the
yeah,
electric cars have to come from somewhere.
yeah.
So
Yeah, we need to crack. If we can crack the old fusion power, that would be a big step in the right direction. We'll see. Maybe in the next decade or a few decades, we might crack
it would
that.
be an
We can do
interesting
that.
side project. Would probably be
Mm,
more lucrative than the podcast, cracking that.
yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know actually. I don't know how far we are on that front.
Well, there's been, I mean, there's a few, what's good is we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. There are
Mhm.
different countries with different fusion reactor designs, all doing their own independent experiments. And I think it definitely seems like there's progress. I think we're some way off yet to sort of being able to harness the sun as it is on Earth. But I think, I feel like we'll probably get there. But it's going to take a bit more time. But it's good to know that there are different smart people looking at it from different views and approaching it in different ways. So hopefully we will crack it at some point.
Yeah, I think if there's anything that will advance us, I think it's a technology, but then it will depend how we use the technology. If we are, it's the same with
Yeah,
wealth. I mean, capitalism is not necessarily the evil. I mean, it's a system we live in, but we can create more wealth for everybody, or we can see it as a zero sum game, which implies if you have this status, somebody else needs to have this status, and then in the end everybody's off worse. So but then you cannot really
yeah.
impose ethics onto a society, and certainly not to individuals. So yeah, it's really hard to predict how
No,
humanity will evolve or disevolve, I think.
that's definitely technology is going to be a big part of it. I mean that there's no denying or getting away from that. And I'm not anti-technological. Like it's important to state that technology is definitely disconnecting us from nature. It's definitely one of the driving forces, particularly to be specific, like electronic entertainment technology and smartphones, things like that are pushing us away from nature. But again, it's context. Like there's some really nifty apps you can get for your smartphone where if you want to identify like something you encounter, like a
Hmm.
plant
Yeah.
outside, like you can pick up and it will tell you what that is and give you like a species name or whatever. So I mean and that's great. So there are yeah, I just heard today there was like I mean, I don't know how it works or whatever, but someone's developed a nature connection app.
Ah,
I mean,
okay.
like,
It sounds
yeah, I
very
mean, I don't
ironic,
know what that
actually.
entails.
That
Sorry.
sounds very ironic. A nature
Yeah,
connection
it does a
app.
little bit, doesn't it? It does a little bit. But I also think that it's interesting, can think of it like with LSD as well. I mean, like Albert Hoffman sort of came to view psychedelics such as LSD that he
Hmm.
invented and discovered as like um, powerful like perhaps their most fundamental role was as nature connecting agents was to sort of reconnect us to the biosphere that we're becoming increasingly alienated from. And it's interesting that it had to be something made in a lab as a product of science and
Hmm.
technology that was then going to be this kind of agent to put us back in touch with nature. So similar to maybe the Nature Connection app, like we're sometimes we just overthink it, maybe a little bit, or or we do it a kind of complicated, convoluted way.
Yeah, it,
But that's human.
it's like what I do. If I want to
That's
know
well
what
in that.
weather it is, I check my app. I don't walk to the window and, and look outside.
Yeah,
And the window is always right though. Like the app, with all its technological background, it's not perfect. Um,
yeah,
but yeah, speaking about the weather, because that makes me think about the subject of uncertainty. It's kind of a nice metaphor, I think, for life. Is it's like with the weather, you can have all the models you want, but still it's unpredictable, and there's always some level of uncertainty. And I think that's maybe why we could use these psychedelics is to better handle and accept uncertainty, including the fact that we will obviously all die and lose everybody and everything that we ever cared about. It's quite a hard thing um, to accept, I think. But yeah, I think a lot of issues now with the in these times of COVID also have to do with yeah, our remembrance that everything, including our own life, can be very uncertain.
yeah,
Not a very positive note, but yeah, yeah.
yeah. No, it's. I think it's an interesting point.
Um,
Yeah.
so another thing I wanted to ask is,
Mhm.
do you know of any studies or any um, evidence from other people's experience with psychedelics and how it relates to their feelings of being connected with a higher individual, let's say a god, because like for me when I did the ayahuasca, I really you can call it like a um, divine experience, and even in some abstract way, I had like some visuals in which you could think of maybe they were like some religious symbols, but at least for me it did not make me more religious. On the contrary, it made me more connected to what is and not on, at least for me, on what is not. But I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's very, I mean, it's very common, like for people to during psychedelic experiences, including people who are, staunchly atheist and have no spiritual beliefs, to have deeply spiritual, transcendental, transformative
Yeah,
experiences.
I was quite surprised by that myself, that I had
Yeah,
that
no,
feeling.
it's in, and you see it as well. I mean, it's maybe a slightly different thing, but you see it with like near-death experiences as well,
Hmm.
which there's definitely a bit of overlap between near-death experiences and psychedelics. But one of the interesting things about near-death experience research is that the same thing applies, that one's prior lack of belief in anything spiritual or religious is not a barrier, or it doesn't protect one from being transformed by those experiences. It makes no difference. So that's quite interesting. But no, even in these studies, people commonly, like, report encountering to what they might label as God, or universal consciousness, or a divine essence of some kind. I'm sort of helping. I've been working on a paper with my friend and colleague, Dr. Ros Watts, who is the study lead of a psilocybin major depression study, and she's kind of made the link between psilocybin and people's recovery from depression.
Hmm.
There being this movement from a state of disconnection to greater connectedness, to
Mm.
great connectedness to self, connectedness to others, and connectedness to world and nature and cosmos and something spiritual a
And
lot of
even
the
if
time.
you would look at a functional MRI scan, like correct me if I'm wrong, you would see more connectedness between your brain regions. So like it would fill the holes in the cheese a little bit.
So yeah, well, there's multiple levels of connection going on here, which is interesting. So on the level of the neuron, psychedelics increase synaptic dendritic formation. So the
Hmm.
connections between neurons increase
Hmm.
post psychedelic. When you're on a psychedelic, there's different things happening. So within network connectivity in the brain is going down. So within individual networks, that connectivity is going down, but then global connectivity of the brain, so connectivity between brain regions, is going up.
That's interesting
Yes.
because if you look at autism, you have too much little connections, little roads between your neurons, but you have less highways between the brain regions. So it's
Mm,
uh it's a very
interesting.
complementary thing that you say now.
Yeah, that's an important thing because it's easy to miss. But yeah, there's disconnection and greater connection happening at the
Mm.
same time, but just on different scales.
Hmm.
And then once we move past, like, the neuroscience of the brain, we can, like, things like connection to core self. People who are depressed can feel like they're disconnected from themselves, let alone other people. But then obviously, yeah, connectedness to others. We're a social tribal species. Our connection to other people, our loved ones, our friends, our family is of fundamental importance for our health and well-being. It's been described that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. It's not being sober. It's being connected. And the addiction can happen when there's in the void created by a lack of connection.
Ah, okay, that's an
Um,
interesting way to put it, I think.
mm. And I think there might be something to that. I mean, it might be more nuanced, there might be more to it, but I think that's an interesting thing. Rather than, sobriety, addiction, like, it's not really. I think there's more to it than that. There's more of an elastic spectrum going on there, I think. And then, yeah, connectedness to nature, connectedness to world, and then connectedness to the universe itself. Full zoom out, kind of big picture overview effect, kind of like what the astronauts report seeing planet Earth from space.
Yeah.
That kind of perspective.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how different psychedelics can have different effects on the brain, even though they might bind to the same receptors, and then how they can be so different from medication that has kind of, at least in the models, the same physiology. Sorry for my English.
Mm,
Than these compounds, but still they have profoundly different effects.
yeah. No, the brain is a very, chemistry is a very exact science, first of all,
Hmm.
as they say. And this is kind of rendered even more salient when the human brain is involved. So, it just seemingly very subtle tweaks. I mean, like, chemically, DMT and psilocin, the active component in magic mushrooms, they're almost identical. I mean, they're
Yeah,
incredibly similar compounds,
that's
but
also
they.
the example I was talking about. It's
Mm,
it's weird how they are still so different.
yes. So it only takes very minor tweaks. I mean, another nice example is lysergic acid amide and LSD.
Hmm.
And the only difference between them, people say that, LSD is a lab made compound, and it is, but it's primarily its fundamental chemical blueprint is natural, is nature. Like, it's the vast majority of its molecule was made in nature, long before it was ever tinkered with in a lab. And then I think it's two, is it two hydrogens? Two hydrogens have been turned to, or one hydrogen has been turned into a carbon that then has more hydrogens attached. And it's quite a tiny tweak on this fairly large molecule and it changes it from being something that's active in the milligram range and it is like basically a sedative,
Hmm.
not particularly psychedelic, to something that isn't remotely a sedative and is incredibly psychedelic and very potent as well. So these seemingly tiny tweaks can really scale up when you've got the brain involved.
Yeah, it's one of the most complex systems that exist. Like for instance, I often build. I'm a computer nerd. I often build machine learning models, and like if
Mm.
you would think of a neural network, it's very much a black box. You have a lot of inputs, you have an output, but then there's no logical way of explaining how does this neural network, how does it come to this output, um, which a lot of people cannot accept because they want control over the model you're making. But I think it's the same with the brain. Like if I say to you, think of an animal, you maybe you thought of an elephant or a deer, I don't know, but you cannot consciously say how did you decide to pick an elephant, and still it is there. And
Mm.
yeah, it's not because we don't understand something, like for instance how psychedelics might work, and maybe we will never understand fully that we should not accept and embrace the positive effects it can have.
Yeah, yeah. Um, cool. Good stuff. Good chat.
Yeah, so I think maybe now is a good time to see, since we do this whole live thing, if there are any people having questions or if they are already bored with us.
Okay,
Um, I will check.
cool.
It would be embarrassing if there were no questions because I spent like a couple of hours today fixing this live stream thing. I
Yeah.
don't think we have any actually. Oh, okay.
Well, have we still
Here
got any
I have
people?
one from somebody. What is the meaning of life?
Oh, this is one I
What a
think like
bastard.
that's such a human bloody
Hmm.
question to ask, isn't it? Like
Yeah.
we're ever striving for meaning. Our brains are meaning makers. They seek pattern and meaning in all they encounter. That's what they've evolved to do. That's what they're very good at. Um, but unfortunately, like often there might not necessarily be meaning. It might be something that
Hmm.
our human minds are kind of subscribing to things and connecting dots. That's what we do. We seek patterns and stuff. You know, like the whole even the thing harking back to the lion in the bush, the lions that might be eating us. Like our brains have become very evolved to very good at seeing faces in things. You know, it's why like some people see Jesus's face in a slice of toast and stuff like that. You know, it's pareidolia. I think it's the thing of seeing faces in things, and our brains over. It's almost overly wired for that
Hmm.
because it's kind of and a lot of our processing power goes into sort of facial recognition and stuff like that. But our brains are meaning makers, and psychedelics vamp up this already inherent capacity even more. So perhaps on one hand, the answer to that question would be perhaps there is no meaning to life. Perhaps like it just
Maybe we
is.
don't really matter. We're just some bags of meat, and we all die in the
Well,
end.
I mean, in a cosmic perspective, maybe, but like, I mean, that doesn't mean like we should be glum.
Hmm.
I mean, like, it's just the fact that like there's a lot of like chance happenings and like the fact that we're here having this conversation and able to contemplate these like deep philosophical questions. Like a lot of different events have had to occur in our planet's history, evolutionary history, geological history, for this to come to be, you know? If that comet hadn't come down and taken the dinosaurs out, it's like it's very would have risen to where they are now, with us as part of that. And like, but my if I was going to be a bit deeper, so that's one answer, is that there just is no meaning. Like life just is, and
Hmm.
it's through, like, you know,
There is at least no commonly shared meaning among all
no,
human beings.
no. So it's up to you to find your own meaning. And I think that there's great freedom in that. But if I was going to be a little bit more sort of deeper and philosophical, I would say the meaning of life is to, um, well, for me, I love to learn. Like, I think it's to do with growth, learning, experience,
Hmm.
things like that. That they're what I feel is important and give my life meaning.
Yeah, I think everybody has their own genetic makeup and things they are good at or are just feel like it is their birthright to do. And I think it might sound a bit romantic, but you should just do that. And like for me, it's a bit the same. I like learning. I like new information. I'm easily bored. That's why I like doing podcasts.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's like one meaning. It's yeah. Again, if you ask a question, you create separation, like a meaning where there has to be a meaning that is shared by all human beings. I think it's just
yeah.
absolutely
No, I
impossible.
don't see it as a one size fits all, approach. Like, everyone's obviously entitled to their own beliefs and their own journey towards meaning. But yeah, it rubs me the wrong way when some people think like, I have the answer, or my religion has the answer, or my belief system has the answer. Your views are automatically wrong
Hmm.
through not aligning to mine. And I don't have much time for that. I don't think it works like that. It's not a one size fits all type deal. So, but yeah, great freedom in being able to kind of pursue your own meaning, your own
Yeah, it's
purpose.
a
I mean, meaning
luxury
and
thing.
purpose.
Like
Are, are-
like I think a lot of people in poor countries in Africa, they don't ask what's the meaning of life or what should I do with my life. They just like they have kind of the luxury, if I can call it that, that they have to worry about food and shelter and maybe even lions.
yeah,
It makes life so much more simple. Um,
yeah.
okay, final question. Again, somebody from the audience. She asked, "How do you feel about overpopulation of humans in relationship to climate change?"
Um, so it's complex. I mean,
Yeah, sorry,
I
you
think
really didn't get one simple question today, I think.
no, no, it's cool. No, I'm up for that. I like. It's nice to be ask good questions. So overpopulation, I do think overpopulation of humans is an issue. Some people dismiss that there's an overpopulation issue, and it's our
Hmm.
resource usage is hugely unequal. Like, the amount, you say, your average American or someone in Western Europe uses compared to, say, someone in
Hmm.
Africa or
Yeah.
East Asia uses. And there's, like, like, I think it was like 30, well, I remember learning at school. I mean, it might have changed since then, but it was like, I think 30 Bangladeshi people, same resources, energy, water, as a single American
Hmm.
person. So there is a huge
That
discrepancy
doesn't even
in.
surprise me. That's a bad thing.
No, yeah, I mean, it might be like, so that there is a huge variation in the amount that people are contributing. So there's an interesting thing I read recently. Well, and it's quite a sad thing, really, is that, like, the I think it's like the billion of the poorest people in the world, a good chunk of the world's population, but the poorest,
Hmm.
contribute, like, very small amounts of carbon dioxide, of greenhouse gas emissions, to the overall, compared to everyone else. And yet they are going to be the most vulnerable to the change that comes. They are going to be most at risk, while also being the least contributors to it. So there's this huge imbalance and discrepancy between sort of, people, well, contributing to this. And I'm not getting on a soapbox here. Like, as part of my work, even though it is as an ecologist doing a bit of habitat creation stuff, I still like drive around and burn fossil fuels. And I've flown
Hmm.
to places, I've burnt fossil fuels there. I've eaten stuff that's got probably a heavy carbon footprint. I've thrown plastic away.
Oh, you
I've
bastard.
tried to recycle it, but like, I've my existence here has a footprint and a cost. And yeah, it's so I don't know. I feel like humanity. I mean, it seems like a lot of people are, in denial that there's sort of well, firstly, some people don't know maybe the big to just discriminate between biodiversity loss and climate change, and there's
Hmm.
confusion over what those two things are. And yes, they do overlap, and yes, they influence each other, but they're two big separate issues
Hmm.
of their own.
Definitely.
And I think there's a bit of confusion there. And I feel like, yeah, given the scale of these issues that we talked about, people can't quite maybe get their heads around them. But at the same time, I don't think we should be I don't think being too doom and gloomy with your message is that good either. Like, I think it's better to maybe motivate people, like, you know, if we did adopt a sort of like more low carbon approach to life, like, yes, we'd have to shift world economies away from fossil fuels and oil and stuff, but we'd basically, like, there's a report out today that like air pollution, like, is killing loads of people. Like,
Hmm.
there's, our society, irrespective of climate change, there's a lot of negatives, and we could definitely sort of, by moving away from our dependency on these fossil fuels, which we should be leaving in the ground. We're chucking out all this stuff into the atmosphere was put down many millions of years ago, over great lengths of time, and we're just chucking it out at massive speed and volume.
Yeah, and
And
then
there's
like
no
you,
way that can't have an effect on the greater system. That's not how nature works.
yeah, and I think
Um,
like you say, it's the people who contribute the least bad that will end up having the worst detrimental effects on their health. And I think it's with
Unfortunately
that with
so.
a lot of things. In Yeah, in life, it's like with big companies. If a CEO is paid a lot of money because he has a lot of responsibility, but then he doesn't lose anything if the company has bad results. Maybe he doesn't get a big bonus. It's the
Mm,
people at the ground that have to be
yeah,
fired and things like that. And we have
yeah.
like this thing where we have a lot of respect for people who we consider having certain values or character traits, but yeah, they have nothing to lose, and we are actually now ruining other people's life, with
Yeah,
with our more advanced society, if I can call it like that.
yeah, yeah. No, fair enough.
All right, I think this is a uh, good point. We've talking quite long, I think,
I think we
an
have.
hour and a half.
We've done a good
Wow.
old.
And
Yeah,
then
no, it's. I mean,
they give me the diagnosis of autism. That's we have to reconsider that. I don't think it's true. Uh,
yeah. No, it's been fun. It's flown by.
yeah,
Um,
I think we have no more questions, so I think we can stop the broadcast. So to
cool. Okay.
everybody
Well, I'm gonna go
watching,
and have.
thank you. Um,
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks for having me. I'm gonna go and chill out now. Have some dinner
oh yeah,
and relax and
that's a
decompress a
it's a
bit.
very good idea. So yeah, thanks a lot. It was fun.
Yeah, it was.
All right.
Nice to connect, Stephen. Take care of
Yeah, you
yourself.
too. Bye bye.
Bye bye. All the best.